Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are focusing on one of the great political paradoxes of American history, the spectacular, powerful, and, well, incredibly brief existence of the Whig Party.
Yeah, it's fascinating. When you look at the political landscape from about 1828 to 1854, that's what historians call the second party system, it seems dominated by this fierce, stable loyalty between Democrats and Whigs.
Right.
But the Whigs themselves, they only really existed for 20 years. It's one of the shortest lifespans for a major national party in U.S. history. It's quite remarkable.
20 years. Wow. That's barely enough time to get comfortable, let alone reshape a nation. Yet they really did profoundly influence the political debates, didn't they?
Absolutely. And crucially, they provided the sort of intellectual foundation for the party that would eventually steer the nation through the Civil War.
So our mission today is to really unpack the dramatic story of this coalition. How did they manage to coalesce around this powerful economic vision? Why were they victims of just, unprecedented presidential bad luck?
Oh, the luck factor is huge.
And ultimately, how did the fundamental moral chasm of slavery just rip them apart from the inside out?
It's really the ultimate case study, how a coalition, no matter how politically brilliant it might seem on paper, can just suffer a catastrophic structural failure when it can't reconcile its members' core interests.
Mm-hmm.
And to start, you absolutely have to understand that the Whigs weren't born out of some positive, unified philosophy. They were born, frankly, in a panic.
A panic.
Yeah. Their formation around 1834, it was really a necessary strategic response to the perceived dominance and, this is key, the executive overreach of President Andrew Jackson.
Okay, so let's unpack that genesis. The primary unifying force wasn't a policy, it was. It was basically just being anti-Jackson, comprehensive anti-Jacksonianism.
Pretty much. Andrew Jackson essentially created his own greatest opponents just through the sheer force of his personality and his actions.
Why was the opposition so fundamental, and why did they immediately jump to branding Jackson as, well, a tyrant?
Well, the branding was very intentional and, honestly, quite brilliant political maneuvering. They deliberately borrowed the name Whig directly from the British political faction, the one that had historically opposed royal power, specifically the power of the monarch.
Ah, okay.
So by calling themselves Whigs, they were implicitly and very, very publicly labeling Andrew Jackson as King Andrew.
Right.
They genuinely believed he was acting like an unaccountable monarch, trampling on the constitutional rights of Congress, the other branches of government.
That is fantastic political theater, really effective branding. But what specific evidence did they actually point to? What justified this accusation of executive tyranny in their eyes?
The main piece of evidence, the smoking gun for them, was Jackson's radical and frankly unprecedented use of the presidential veto.
Ah, the veto.
Yes. The Whigs were deeply committed to this idea of legislative supremacy. They believed Congress, representing the people, should be the engine driving policy. Jackson just completely turned that on its head. He used the presidential veto power more frequently during his 8 years in office than all 6 of his predecessors combined.
Wow. Okay, wait. More than all the previous presidents put together?
Bear in mind, over his 8 years. It was a staggering statistic then, and it still is now.
That really signals a massive shift in how American government works, doesn't it?
Oh, a seismic shift. For example, back in 1830, Jackson vetoed a bill to fund the Maysville Road in Kentucky. Now, his argument was that it was purely a local project and therefore unconstitutional for the federal government to fund.
Seems reasonable on the surface, maybe?
Perhaps, but it set a really crucial tone. Jackson was basically positioning himself, the executive, as the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution. He was challenging the primacy of the legislature that had actually passed the bill.
Right.
And for the Whigs, this was definitive proof. This was him fundamentally undermining the whole system of checks and balances.
Okay, so their entire platform starts with wanting to restore constitutional restraint. But here's the inherent contradiction, right? This reactive nature meant they basically had to accept anyone who hated Jackson, regardless of their own core philosophy.
Yeah.
Who did they manage to cram into this, well, inherently unstable coalition?
That's the structural limitation baked right into the Whig DNA from day one. The source material confirms it's this incredibly diverse, often contradictory mix.
Like who?
Well, you had wealthy Northern Federalists, the old national Republicans, who actually favored a strong central government and economic planning.
Okay.
But crucially, they were united with powerful Southern planters and slave owners, who historically had always favored states' rights.
Wait, those two groups sound completely opposed?
They often were. And then you had other groups like the states' writers who paradoxically joined the Whigs because they hated Jackson's centralization. Specifically, things like his controversial, really heavy-handed Indian removal policies.
Hold on. You have people who want strong central planning sitting next to people who want states to have the ultimate say. How on earth did they function?
Well, that's the point. They could fight Jackson together. That was the glue. But they couldn't really govern cohesively. The coalition just lacked that crucial ideological homogeneity, that shared vision needed to actually implement a positive national agenda once the external threat Jackson was gone.
So their survival depended on keeping that anti-Jackson feeling alive.
Or finding another enemy. Or, and this became key, finding a unifying economic policy that could somehow bridge those gaps.
And that's where the bank war comes in. This wasn't abstract constitutional theory anymore. This was about money, right? Cold, hard cash.
Exactly.
How did the conflict over the second bank of the United States transform those abstract fears into something tangible, an economic threat that could actually rally a national base?
This was absolutely the moment. This is when abstract constitutional worries became a real fight for financial stability.
Yeah.
Jackson, you see, viewed the second bank of the United States as this engine of the elite. He claimed it catered only to wealthy private interests, foreign investors even.
So he targeted it.
Oh, fiercely. In 1832, he famously vetoed the bill to recharter the bank. But he didn't stop there. He escalated the crisis drastically in 1833. He unilaterally ordered the removal of all federal deposits from the bank.
Just pulled the plug.
Pulled the plug and distributed those federal funds into various state-chartered institutions. Critics immediately started calling them pet banks.
Pet banks. Okay, and what was the immediate tangible effect of just scattering federal money into these presumably less regulated state banks?
Chaos, basically. Economic instability and speculation just ran rampant. Whig leaders like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster immediately jumped on this. They condemned Jackson's action not just as an unconstitutional power grab, which they believed it was, but as a direct assault on the nation's financial stability. Jackson's move destabilized the national currency. It triggered this massive wave of lending and speculative frenzy, which contributed directly to the devastating economic downturn known as the Panic of 1837, which conveniently for Jackson hit shortly after he left office.
So Jackson's anti-monopoly talk, his attack on the bank, it basically terrified every banker, every business person, every industrialist across the country.
Precisely. This immediate drastic action rallied the financial and industrial class almost instantly. Anyone who valued, currency stability, managed credit, predictable markets, they saw the Democrats' actions as pure chaos.
So they ran to the Whigs.
They flocked to the Whig banner. It transformed executive tyranny from a sort of abstract legal concept into a direct threat to their livelihoods. And this provided those disparate Whig factions with their first really solid, powerful economic cement. The shared desire for a sound financial system.
Okay, so they found some economic glue. Yet, despite this newfound unity on the bank issue, their first national electoral strategy in 1836, it failed miserably, right? And it exposed the exact sectionalism we were just talking about.
It exposed the lack of national unity perfectly. They looked at the map and realized no single Whig candidate could realistically beat Jackson's hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, in a straight-up national contest.
So what did they do?
They adopted this desperate, almost parliamentary kind of measure. They ran 3 regional candidates simultaneously, Daniel Webster in the east, Hugh L. White in the south, and William Henry Harrison out in the west.
3 candidates. What was the goal there? To split the vote.
Exactly. To split the popular vote so badly that Van Buren couldn't win an outright majority in the Electoral College. The hope was to force the election into the House of Representatives.
Where they thought they could broker a deal.
Precisely. It was a strategy based entirely on procedural maneuvering rather than, actual national appeal.
And it didn't work.
Nope. Van Buren won outright. But the failure taught the Whigs a crucial lesson. If they really wanted the presidency, they needed a single national figure. They needed a hero, someone capable of bridging those sectional and ideological divides.
Which they would eventually find in 1840.
Exactly. With Harrison, ironically enough.
Okay, so that 1836 failure really forced the Whigs to move beyond just being anti-Jackson. They had to articulate a positive program, something they were for, and they centered this on legislative supremacy.
Yes.
What was the constitutional philosophy behind this push? It's sometimes called parliamentarism, right?
Yeah, you could call it that. Parliamentarism was essentially the exact inverse of Jacksonian democracy in their view. They sought to fundamentally diminish the power of the president, who they genuinely felt was acting as the chief policymaker, almost like a king. Their goal was to significantly increase the power of Congress, which they viewed as the true representative body, the place where national policy should be forged through deliberation, debate, and consensus.
So the goal wasn't just to weaken the president necessarily, but to strengthen the whole system of checks and balances. Protect against maybe unchecked majority rule driven by one powerful figure?
Precisely. They believed that policy should be painstakingly hammered out in the legislature. That process allowed regional interests to negotiate and compromise, rather than having policy dictated by a single, potentially, despotic executive.
Okay.
And this philosophy naturally paved the way for Henry Clay's American system.
Yeah.
That became the engine for all that policy, the positive economic core of the Whig Party.
Right, the American system. Tell us about that. This was Clay's really ambitious blueprint for a modern, meritocratic, nationally integrated America, and it demanded active federal involvement, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a truly national vision for economic growth, very distinct from the more laissez-faire, hands-off approach favored by the Democrats at the time.
So what were the key pillars, the essential interlocking pieces of this plan?
Okay, there were basically three main pillars. First, protective tariffs. They advocated for high tariffs on imported goods.
Why high tariffs?
Well, the intent was twofold. One, generate revenue for the federal government. But crucially, two, shield those burgeoning northern domestic industries, textiles, ironworks, manufacturing from cheaper foreign competition. The idea was to let them grow, innovate, and create jobs.
Okay, tariffs. What's number two?
Second, the reestablishment of a national bank. And this wasn't just about regulating currency, though that was part of it. They envisioned a modernized national banking system.
Doing what?
Acting as a fiscal agent for the Treasury, stabilizing credit, managing the money supply to promote broad investment and national stability. Basically, preventing the kind of reckless speculation that they blamed for the Panic of 1837.
Makes sense. And the third pillar?
And third, internal improvements. This meant massive federal spending on infrastructure. We're talking roads, canals, and later railroads.
Connecting the country.
Exactly. The goal was to physically integrate the national economy, connect Western farmlands to Eastern markets, facilitate commerce between regions, ensure that national prosperity benefited all sections, North, South, and West.
That's a really comprehensive vision. It sounds like a party pushing for progress and modernization. Who did this appeal to? Who formed the Whig socioeconomic base?
It really resonated with the emerging urban and professional classes. So you talk about manufacturers, bankers, lawyers, doctors, shopkeepers, the growing urban middle class.
Interesting. Anyone else?
Yes. Significantly, the Whig base also included highly active Protestant Christians, especially evangelicals. And there were nativist elements, too, people who believed the government had a role in promoting morality and temperance.
And how did they frame this whole economic vision philosophically? What was the sales pitch?
They championed what they called the harmony of interests. Their argument was that this system benefited everyone, top to bottom. They claimed that the factory owner, the merchant who shipped the goods, even the laborer who worked the line, everyone benefited from a protected, stable, and integrated national economy. They explicitly rejected the Democrats' constant appeal to class conflict. Instead, they advocated for national growth, led by, men of talent and virtue, uniting capital and labor for the common good.
Okay, harmony of interests. But now we hit the fatal flaw, the built-in contradiction. That vision, this robust American system, it was inherently incompatible with the Southern wing of their own party, wasn't it? Even though those Southern planters also hated Jackson.
This is the contradiction that would ultimately just shatter them. The American system was perfectly tailored for the industrializing North. It was frankly disastrous for the agrarian South.
What disastrous?
Southern planters relied heavily on exporting raw materials, mostly cotton, internationally, and they needed cheap imported goods for their plantations and their families. Protective tariffs actively harmed them by driving up the cost of manufactured goods they needed to buy, and potentially inviting retaliatory tariffs from European buyers of their cotton. It hit them coming and going.
So the Southern Whigs were constantly put in a position where they had to fight the core economic ideology of their own party.
Constantly. They had to consistently downplay economic policy when campaigning in the South. The source material makes it clear. To win crucial Southern votes, think about Zachary Taylor in 1848, the National Whigs often had to sacrifice the American system platform almost entirely.
And focus instead on
giving assurances regarding the security and stability of the institution of slavery. The party was constantly trading away its cohesive economic identity for the sake of sectional political power.
Wow.
Which meant the unstable, explosive issue of slavery effectively became the destructive glue holding the coalition together, rather than the economic vision.
This structural weakness also played out in foreign policy, right? Specifically regarding expansionism. The Whigs were famously sort of anti-manifest destiny. Why did they resist that seemingly popular urge to expand the nation westward?
Yeah, their restraint was really a mix of, let's say, classical ideology and just pure pragmatism. On the ideological side, many Whigs held a general, sort of classical liberal distaste for aggressive, opportunistic land grabs. They felt it was morally dubious and financially reckless.
Okay, and the pragmatic side?
But on the pragmatic side, they recognized the terrifying political truth. Every single new piece of territory acquired, whether it's from Mexico or through annexation like Texas, would inevitably reopen the politically fatal question of whether slavery would be allowed to expand into those territories.
And the Whigs desperately wanted to avoid that fight.
At all costs. They saw it as the one issue that could, and eventually did, destroy them.
And this anti-expansionism stance, it actually cost Henry Clay the 1844 election, didn't it? Which must have been a devastating loss for the party's main intellectual architect.
Oh, it was catastrophic for Clay and the party. He lost to James K. Polk, primarily because he utterly misjudged the public fervor for expansionism, particularly the annexation of Texas.
What was his position initially?
Clay initially held a pretty firm position opposing Texas annexation. He argued, quite correctly as it turned out, that it would disrupt the delicate balance of free and slave states in the Senate and would almost certainly lead to war with Mexico.
Which, of course, it did. But the politics forced him to change his tune.
Exactly. He came under extreme pressure from Southern Whigs who desperately wanted Texas annexed, mostly to expand slavery. So late in the campaign, Clay tried to equivocate. He wrote several conflicting public letters trying to sort of fudge his position, appeal to both sides.
How did that work out?
Terribly. These shifts satisfied absolutely no one. His ambiguity alienated crucial Northern abolitionist and anti-expansionist supporters, arguably costing them the critical electoral votes of New York.
And that handed the presidency to Polk.
Handed it to the aggressive, expansionist Democrat, James K. Polk. And this failure just confirmed, yet again, that the core Whig economic platform was always secondary to the volatile issue of sectional balance and slavery.
So, consequently, the party largely opposed the Mexican-American War itself.
Yes, they viewed it, generally, as an unnecessary, aggressive democratic venture purely for territorial gain, a land grab that would only worsen the sectional crisis they feared.
Okay, let's shift gears and discuss what has to be one of the most incredible, almost unbelievable runs of political bad luck in American history. The Whigs actually had a winning electoral strategy, didn't they? Nominate non-political military heroes to win the White House.
That was the plan. Harrison in 1840, Taylor in 1848.
They won twice using this strategy, yet tragedy struck both times, preventing them from ever actually implementing their vision. It's incredible.
It really is. This section reads like pure political melodrama. The Whig Party successfully elected 2 presidents, and both died in office relatively quickly.
Just stopping the implementation of the American system dead in its tracks.
Not once, but twice. And each time placing power in the hands of vice presidents who were, shall we say, politically disloyal or outright hostile to the core Whig agenda.
Let's start with the first instance, the Harrison-Tyler crisis of 1841. Harrison wins the election, seemingly giving the Whigs a clear mandate for the American system. What happened in those fateful, 32 days?
It's almost tragically comical in a way. William Henry Harrison was 68 years old. He was anxious to prove he was still robust and vigorous, despite his age. So he refused to wear a coat or hat during his incredibly lengthy inaugural address.
Oh, no.
Which he delivered in the freezing cold March rain. He caught a severe cold almost immediately. It quickly progressed to pneumonia.
And just like that.
Only 32 days into his term, he tragically died. He became the first U.S. president ever to die in office.
That is truly shocking. Not only did it halt their entire agenda right out of the gate, but it must have created an immediate constitutional crisis, right? The process of succession had never actually been tested before.
Absolutely. The Constitution was surprisingly vague on the exact details. John Tyler, the vice president, was immediately sworn in. But Tyler was a problem for the Whigs.
Why?
He had been nominated purely for sectional balance. He was a states' rights Virginian, a former Democrat, actually, who deeply opposed Andrew Jackson, yes, but also deeply hated central banking and high tariffs, the core tenets of the Whig economic plan.
So he was basically a Whig in name only.
Pretty much. He was put on the ticket to attract Southern votes, not because he believed in the Whig platform.
And Tyler quickly proceeded to betray the fundamental Whig commitment to curbing executive power by using the presidential veto himself, the very tool the Whigs were founded to restrain.
The irony is just crushing, isn't it? Congressional Whigs, led by Henry Clay, who is now in the Senate, immediately got to work. They drafted and passed two separate bills designed to reestablish a national bank, the centerpiece of the American system.
And
Tyler vetoed the first bill. He cited constitutional concerns, sounding a bit like Jackson, ironically. Clay and the Whigs quickly regrouped, revised the bill slightly to try and meet his objections, and passed the second version. Tyler vetoed that one, too.
Wow. That's just the ultimate middle finger to his own party, basically. How did the Whig leadership in Congress respond to this blatant executive betrayal?
They went nuclear. Absolutely enraged, Whig leadership publicly denounced Tyler as a traitor. They accused him of using Jacksonian executive power against the very party that was dedicated to stopping it.
What did they do specifically?
The entire cabinet, which Harrison had appointed and was full of Whig loyalists, resigned in protest. All except one notable exception, Secretary of State Daniel Webster, who stayed on briefly to finish treaty negotiations.
And Tyler himself.
Furthermore, Tyler was formally expelled from the Whig Party just 2 days after his second bank veto. He spent almost the entire rest of his 4-year term as a president without a party. And this constitutional crisis, this infighting, it permanently crippled the Whigs' ability to consolidate power and achieve their economic goals during that crucial window. They spent the next 3 years basically fighting their own president instead of the Democrats.
Just a disaster of epic proportions. And yet, incredibly, 8 years later, they managed to win the presidency again with Zachary Taylor in 1848. But the tragedy repeated itself almost exactly, didn't it? And this time, it happened amid the rising fatal sectional tension following the Mexican-American War.
It's uncanny. Taylor was another military hero, old, rough, and ready. Crucially, he was also an enslaver from Louisiana, whom Southern Whigs trusted implicitly on the issue of slavery. He was successfully marketed as another national unifying figure who could appeal to both North and South.
But like Harrison.
But like Harrison, Taylor died abruptly in office in July 1850, roughly 16 months into his term. The cause was likely acute gastroenteritis, perhaps from contaminated food or water at a 4th of July celebration, though the exact circumstances are still debated by some historians.
And his death elevated Vice President Millard Fillmore to the presidency. Fillmore was an anti-slavery Northerner from New York, right?
Correct.
So he takes over at the absolute worst possible moment, just as Congress is desperately trying to figure out the status of slavery in those massive new territories acquired from Mexico.
Exactly. Fillmore found himself immediately caught between these two warring factions, within his own adopted party and the nation. Working alongside the aging Whig titans, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, Fillmore successfully guided the sprawling, incredibly contentious Compromise of 1850 through Congress.
They really thought this could save the Union.
They genuinely believed this package of laws was the only way to hold the Union together and diffuse the immediate crisis. Admitting California as a free state, organizing the rest of the territories without immediate slavery restrictions based on popular sovereignty, resolving the Texas border dispute.
It seemed like a grand bargain. But the Compromise of 1850 contained an incredibly destructive, morally toxic component specifically designed to appease the South, the new fugitive slave law.
Yes. This is where we really need to get specific, because this law was so fatally divisive.
Why? What made it so much worse than previous fugitive slave laws?
The 1850 fugitive slave law was draconian. It was incredibly stringent, and it essentially required the federal government to actively enforce slavery within the free states. This wasn't just symbolic. It mandated Northern complicity in the slave system.
What were its specific provisions that just enraged Northerners so much?
Okay, first, it established federal commissioners who were specifically tasked with hearing cases regarding accused fugitive slaves. Now, critically, these commissioners were paid $10 if they ruled in favor of the slave catcher, meaning sending the person back into bondage.
$10.
But only $5 if they ruled against the claimant, declaring the person free.
That sounds like a bribe.
It was immediately condemned across the North as legally bribing officials to favor slavery. Second, the accused person was denied the right to a jury trial and, crucially, could not testify on their own behalf. Basic legal protections were just stripped away.
And most alarmingly, perhaps, it forced ordinary Northern citizens to participate.
Exactly. That was the real kicker for many. It mandated that federal marshals and their deputies, and by extension, any ordinary citizen they could conscript or deputize on the spot, were legally required to aid in the capture and return of accused runaways.
So you could be forced to help catch someone?
Yes. Anyone refusing to assist or actively hindering the capture faced severe fines and imprisonment. This meant the moral horror of slavery was suddenly thrust directly into the homes and streets of every free state. It forced Northern Whigs, and all Northerners really, to choose between their legal duty under federal law and their moral conscience.
And by signing that compromise package, which included this law, Fillmore, the Northern Whig successor president, effectively signaled that the party's commitment to national unity, to preserving the Union, superseded any moral objections to the demands of what opponents called the slave power.
It was the final straw, especially for the Northern conscience Whigs, the more abolitionist-leaning wing of the party. Fillmore, acting, he believed, in the name of national union, fatally estranged the moral and reform-minded wing of his own party.
Just devastating.
The inability of their own elected presidents or their successors to uphold either the party's core economic platform or basic moral consistency. It just ensured the Whigs were denied the time, the unity, the leadership needed to stabilize. The party was effectively broken after 1850.
It seems pretty clear by the late 1840s, early 1850s, the Whigs were just structurally incapable of bridging this moral chasm over slavery. The party formally cleaved into these sectional wings based entirely on that single issue, right?
Yeah, the division became formalized and undeniable. You essentially had two distinct warring groups operating somehow under the same Whig banner.
Okay, let's define those factions clearly for everyone. Who were the conscience Whigs?
In the North, you had the conscience Whigs. They were vehemently anti-slavery, or at least strongly opposed to its expansion. They viewed slavery as a moral corruption, something fundamentally incompatible with the American vision of liberty and progress.
And they acted on this belief.
Many did. Many actively aided in the founding of the Free Soil Party back in 1848, which ran specifically on the platform of opposing the expansion of slavery into any new territories.
Okay, so conscience Whigs in the North.
Yeah.
And their Southern counterpart?
They became known as the Cotton Whigs. These were primarily Southern Whigs who strongly supported the economic interests tied to the slave system. Their priority became maintaining sectional harmony with the South, even if it meant sacrificing the national Whig economic agenda.
So they often sided with Democrats on slavery issues.
On sectional issues, they often aligned almost seamlessly with Southern Democrats. They essentially acted as a pro-slavery firewall within the national Whig Party structure, constantly pushing for compromises favorable to slaveholding interests.
So the Whig Party had become two basically mutually exclusive political operations just running under the same name.
That's a very good way to put it. Yeah.
And this internal hollowness, this fundamental contradiction, it led directly to that catastrophic defeat in the 1852 presidential election, didn't it? Their attempt at neutrality just failed utterly.
It was a decisive, humiliating defeat that really sounded the party's death knell at the national level. The Whigs were desperate to find another hero, another unifying figure like Harrison or Taylor, but the selection process itself was a complete mess.
Why?
Because the convention was so deeply divided between the Northern and Southern wings. No candidate could gain a majority initially. They eventually settled on another military leader, General Winfield Scott, over the incumbent President Fillmore.
Why Scott?
Largely because Scott, despite being a Southerner by birth, had spent most of his career outside of politics and was seen as less tainted by the Compromise of 1850 battles than Fillmore was. They hoped he could be a blank slate.
But Scott then attempted the same impossible balancing act that had already failed.
Exactly. His platform was essentially enforce the Compromise of 1850, including the hated fugitive slave law, and condemn any further political agitation of the slavery issue from either side. It was an attempt to find a middle ground that simply no longer existed in American politics.
And how did that go over?
Terribly for the Whigs. Southern Whigs deeply doubted Scott's commitment to enforcing the fugitive slave law. They feared his Northern ties and influences. So they defected in massive numbers to the reliably pro-slavery Democratic Party, which nominated Franklin Pierce.
Pierce won easily.
Pierce won in a landslide. Scott only managed to win 4 states: Vermont, Massachusetts, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The Whig Party was left totally disintegrated at the national level.
Why did they lose so badly?
They lost because, by trying desperately to be all things to all people, by upholding this divisive moral compromise for the sake of preserving the Union, They ended up being politically meaningless or even offensive to both the growing anti-slavery sentiment in the North and the increasingly defensive pro-slavery forces in the South.
Okay, so they somehow survived the 1852 defeat, but just barely. The final legislative action that delivered the coup de grace, the undeniable death blow, came just 2 years later in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
This was it. This was the point of no return, not just for the Whigs, but arguably for American politics leading up to the Civil War.
What did the act do?
Democrats Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois introduced the bill. Its stated purpose was to organize the vast Kansas and Nebraska territories, paving the way for settlement and a transcontinental railroad. But the political dynamite was the principle he attached to it: popular sovereignty.
Popular sovereignty, meaning the settlers in the territory themselves, rather than Congress, would decide whether slavery would be allowed there.
Precisely. And here's the kicker. In order to apply popular sovereignty to those territories, which were north of the line established in 1820, the bill had to formally repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820.
Which had barred slavery north of the 36° 30 parallel for over 30 years.
Exactly. Northerners saw this as an unacceptable radical expansion of slave power into lands previously guaranteed to be free. It felt like a complete betrayal of established law and compromise.
And the Whig Party. It just fractured instantly and permanently over this bill, didn't it?
Instantly. The votes in Congress were almost entirely sectional, cutting right through party lines. Southern Whigs voted overwhelmingly for the Kansas-Nebraska Act alongside their Democratic counterparts. They saw it as a victory for Southern interests, states' rights, and self-determination.
And Northern Whigs.
Northern Whigs, meanwhile, voted almost unanimously in furious opposition. They saw it as the ultimate betrayal of the national interest, a moral outrage, and proof that the slave power would stop at nothing.
So the party structure just couldn't survive that?
Absolutely not. You can't have a national party where members are voting on completely opposite sides of the single most explosive defining issue in the country. The political distance became utterly unbridgeable. The Whig organization, for all practical purposes, dissolved right then and there in 1854.
So following the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, the second-party system effectively ends. The Whig Party is gone. Where did the pieces scatter? Where did the people and the ideas land?
It triggered an immediate, rapid realignment of political forces across the country. The Northern Whigs, the old conscience wing, they abandoned the defunct party structure almost en masse. They migrated overwhelmingly to the newly formed, explicitly anti-slavery Republican Party.
So the Republicans absorbed the Northern Whigs.
Yes, these were the activists, the reformers, the entrepreneurs, the evangelical Protestants. They found a new home, committed to stopping slavery's expansion.
And what about the Southern Whigs? Where did they go?
They were left scrambling, politically homeless. Without a national structure, many briefly joined the nativist American Party, the Know-Nothings, which flared up briefly in the mid-1850s.
And later.
Later, some attempted to organize the Constitutional Union Party in 1860, making one last desperate attempt to cling to the idea of union and compromise above all else. But their influence was severely diminished. The vast majority of the Southern political power structure, including many former Cotton Whigs, eventually flowed into the Democratic Party, which became increasingly dominated by Southern interests.
What's truly fascinating, though, is that while the Whig Party died, their intellectual blueprint didn't entirely disappear, did it? The Republican Party that emerged, it didn't just absorb the people, they absorbed the core Whig platform.
That's a crucial point. The Republicans provided the necessary intellectual bridge. They successfully positioned themselves by adopting the core economic nationalism of Clay's American system.
Like what specifically?
Modernization, high protective tariffs to support industry, federal investment in national infrastructure like railroads and land-grant colleges. They appealed to the exact same urban, industrial, and entrepreneurial base that the Whigs had cultivated in the North.
But with one critical difference.
One absolutely critical difference. The Republicans rejected the Whigs' fatal commitment to sectional compromise on the issue of slavery. They drew a hard line against its expansion.
So the failure of the Whigs was structural, not necessarily ideological.
Exactly. It was entirely structural, the inherent impossibility of housing powerful pro-slavery and powerful anti-slavery forces under the same political tent, especially when fueled by an economic vision that inherently favored one section over the other. Their vision for a modern America was actually quite sound, quite forward-looking in many ways. Their capacity to govern a fundamentally morally divided nation was not.
So when you synthesize the whole Whig story, what really stands out? It seems like this unbelievable confluence of just sheer, incredible bad luck in the executive branch.
The presidential curse. And an inevitable structural failure when confronted with the moral imperative, the sheer force of the slavery issue. I think that sums it up well. It's really the tragedy of high ambition meeting an intractable, horrifying reality.
Yeah.
The Whig Party, despite championing this sophisticated, often unifying vision for American development, a modernized, nationally integrated economy governed by a judicious, powerful legislature, it was ultimately destroyed by two interlocking forces. First, yes, the repeated political misfortune, the deaths in office, which just denied them the chance to execute their plans and build momentum.
Right.
And second, and more fundamentally, their inability to prioritize that national economic policy over the deepening moral and political conflict over human bondage. They tried, desperately, to be pragmatic about an issue that ultimately defied pragmatism. It demanded a moral stand.
And in a way, they provided the intellectual blueprint, the economic vision for the party, the Republicans, that would ultimately navigate and win the Civil War, building on that foundation of the American system. But they just couldn't survive long enough to execute the plan themselves.
Exactly. It's an incredibly short-lived, yet profoundly important legacy. They demonstrated, perhaps tragically, that even a compelling economic ideology must eventually bend to the underlying constitutional and critically moral realities of the nation.
Their story really is a stark reminder, isn't it, that political coalitions, particularly those built mainly on the basis of opposing a common enemy like Jackson, can rarely maintain cohesion when faced with deep internal moral and sectional divides. The glue that holds the structure together has to be stronger than the policy it seeks to promote, especially when that policy itself contains internal contradictions.
Well said. The foundation has to be sound.
Okay, so this leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to explore further. If William Henry Harrison had survived his full term back in 1841...
The great what if.
Right. And if Henry Clay had successfully used a loyal Whig executive to actually implement the national bank, start the ambitious internal improvements of the American system, would that successful early implementation of national economic integration have created enough mutually beneficial ties, enough economic interdependence across the sections to perhaps slightly delay or maybe even somehow soften the subsequent rupture caused by the Kansas-Nebraska Act a decade later? Could economic ties have overridden the moral conflict even temporarily?
It's fascinating to consider, isn't it? Whether economic necessity, that shared prosperity they dreamed of, could have momentarily trumped the deep moral schism. A tough question with no easy answer.
Indeed. Thank you for diving deep with us today on the rise and fall of the Whigs.